Good morning. If you just joined, we'll get started here in just a minute. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to just the webinar on Modern Agile Testing. If this is your first webinar, you'll notice in the Zoom meeting, there's a section up the top for to ask questions. So go ahead and click the Q&A section at the top if you have questions as we go. I'll try to pick up on that and answer somewhere along the presentation. A little bit about me. My name is Robert Shaw. I'm an enterprise Agile coach here with Clearly Agile. I've been in the Agile space for about the last 13 years in some form of Agile leadership, everything from starting out from a team scrum master up to coaching to actual running Agile practices for organizations. Before that, spent 25 years now in the software development space. I got my start back in the mid-1990s in quality assurance. So this topic that we're talking about today is something near and dear to my heart. Always, quality assurance always holds a special place for it. For today, my intent is to paint a completely different picture than what you may be used to or think about when it comes to validating quality into a product. There's a long history of tradition inside of quality assurance practices. There's also some great modern thinking that has been coming up over the past decade or so of new ways of approaching it, especially with modern development and Agile practices. So we're going to explore some of those. It may look and sound different from what you're used to hearing, but hopefully spark some inspiration inside of your organization to maybe experiment with some different paths. All right, so some housekeeping real quick. All right, from Clearly Agile perspective, we are running a number of public and private training classes throughout the year. Up there are common ones with the CSPO, the CSM, or the Scrum Alliance certifications, as well as SAFe certifications for those in the scaling realm. As well as a numerous number of options in Agile team workshops. So if you're interested in pursuing training or some of the workshops, the link is down there below. Feel free to look up what's coming up and connect with us and we can talk some more. Just also, we are hiring. Right now we do have openings for Agile coaches as well as DevOps coaches and full stack .NET developers. There's an email up on the screen. If you or somebody you know is interested or looking, feel free to connect with us and we can talk about it some more. So jumping in, right? This is a little bit, I alluded to it before, but a little bit of kind of my personal journey with Agile testing, right? And maybe this mirrors some of yours or you see similarities in it, right? But in the 90s, right, started out in performance engineering and test automation. Did a little bit of QA work before that, but that was really the first solid foray into it. Spent a lot of time in the QA leadership management space, director of QA, right? And it was about 2005, right? I thought I had it down, thought, had really solidified my career. I knew the space, I knew the topic, was really good at it. And 2005, the wrench got thrown in. It's like, hey, we're going Agile. And you're no longer just a QA manager, you're now a development manager who has both developers and testing folks with it. Right, and that caused me personally to kind of wrestle with this whole notion of traditional QA and what it means to test inside of the Agile space. I mean, when I say wrestle, it was a struggle because it felt like very much like a square peg in a round hole, right? It just did not fit, right? And we kept trying to back into the QA process and make it fit within the time box, and the results were less than spectacular. Right, along that journey, kind of hit that threshold of, right, we just automate everything. Automation is the solution to everything. Automated to the point of overkill. And that actually worked for a little bit until the automation became so heavy, it was almost as bad as trying to do manual regression through things, right? Sometimes taking 3-4 days just to run the front-end automated regression suite. And it was somewhere around there where I realized that it was my thinking about testing that was blocking progress, right? And really went through this journey from about that point forward to unlearn what I had learned or what I had been taught or how I had been approaching it, and needed to relearn some new ways of thinking about it, right? So, right. So when we start with this, right, it's kind of like, what was that realization? Is like, why change, right? Or what was so different, or what had shifted in my world that caused a change in thinking around testing, right? And if you look back, right, short history lesson on testing, right? It was around World War II, right? The 1940s, where we started to see computer and technology come up, electronics were prominent. There was a need to start validating that this was working, right? It wasn't really officially the software development process or the QA process we know today, but it was kind of the roots of it, right? We see the computer first being terminology first being coined. And it was 1946 where we see ISO enter the picture, right? So if, big thing with ISO and testing certification still nowadays, where the majority of some of the standards and practices that we're still using today came out of 1946, right? Fast forward another 30 years, and we see Glenn Myers published the book, The Art of Software Testing, right? Which was really the foundation of a lot of the terminology, practices, right? Test plan, test case, test script, the notion of regression, black box, white box, right? That notion was kind of born out of that 1979 timeframe, right? If we fast forward another 41 years, right? A lot of that has not fundamentally changed in how we approach the subject or topic of testing, right? It's kind of been in the same general version since then, right? Certainly some enhancements, certainly some contributions, but the roots of it, as it was in 1979 in the book, right? Now, if I look back, right, 1979, I was 7 years old. Compile time, right, if you were in the software industry, was very limited. In fact, you had to schedule it in advance if you wanted to compile or run something. Compiling a program could take hours, if not days, depending on the size of the program. If you needed to run the system, you actually had to schedule time and compete against other groups or other areas to actually get runtime on a system, right? It wasn't like we have today where computers are everywhere, right? You had to schedule in advance when you were going to run your application, right? Software ran logic outcomes as a series of programs, kind of where we get that terminology from today, right? So they had a number of inputs. It was usually, not always, but typically some sort of batch process that transformed a set of data into a set of outcomes for a system, but very linear in operation, right? So less interactive like operating systems and software that we have today, more of a logical step-by-step batch flow program to get to the desired end result, right? And back in 1979, there were very few home computers, right? So this was mostly in the business space. There were maybe a few lingering around or people tinkering with the idea of the home computer or the desktop computer, but nowhere near the size and the scale we had today, right? So, we kind of fast forward today, right? By today's standards, right, the software was pretty simple. Programs were process-based, not interactive, right? And it was a lot less complex for them, but by today's standards, a lot less complex than what we deal with today, right? Right. So because that time was limited, right, tests needed to be prepared in advance, right? We had to know upfront and invest upfront in what that is, so that when we ran the software, we knew exactly what the inputs were, exactly what the outputs were. We needed to know how to verify those in advance, right? So it had to be a thought process at that time, right? right? Because we may only get 1 or 2 shots at this, right, before this would run in somebody's environment, right? So we would run it once to identify what the failures were, make the corrections, come back with a second set of tests to validate it that it all worked, right? But it was always on a schedule, right? Next Tuesday, next Wednesday, a month from now, whatever that was, right? So when we look at the QA process that's up there, right, these are sort of the basic outline of the stages, right? The requirements analysis, the planning, the execution, test design, etc. Right? That was a process that was born out of necessity more than anything else, right? The necessity of the way software was built back then. It created some interesting relationships even between QA and development. Right now, today, right, things are a lot more fluid, right? Build happens on demand, deployment could happen at any time. We have this wonderful ability to fail forward as an option, right? If something goes wrong, we can patch or fail things forward very rapidly. All right, there's less risk associated with a defect. Still not good, right? But it's not the months of rework that it was, right? The technology exists today to do this in a more rapid fashion, right? To some degree, capacity has outpaced the process, right? In other words, our capability sorry, not capacity, capability has outpaced the process, right? We can do things faster than actually the process allows, which means it's time to ask the question, does the process now limit the capability, right? Are we on the other side of this where there's some drastic rethink needed in order to evolve to the next level of what software testing means, right? Now, I alluded to this, right? But for decades, right, during that time frame, there was a lot of cost or risk associated with deploying software, right? A lot of times it was entire systems came pre-installed with the software already installed on it. Software would come on disks. It had to be published, and then copies had to be produced and stored in a warehouse ready for shipping. When customer bought a version, right, it usually came on that disk format and had to be installed onto these machines, sometimes taking days to complete the process, right? So if something was wrong with the software, if something was catastrophic, it could be financially crushing for an organization back then, right? They would have to redo it, recompile it, retest it, reproduce it, throw away the old versions, right? Or create a new version for it, ship that out to the customers, and they would also have to incur the cost of doing the updates, right? Because of that and the nature of that, for decades, right, for the longest period of time, QA was actually given the authority to stop production and shifting software. They held the keys to the kingdom, right? Sometimes still jokingly refer to it today as the good old days, where we would catapult new code and bugs back and forth over a wall at each other, right? Where QA was the gatekeeper to production, right? They were given that empowered authority to stop, right? And that caused the QA process as we know it today to thrive for a period of time, right? Code was monolithic, difficult to fix forward, right? And if you kind of just continue that out, as software became more complex, the number of tests increased, right? So software didn't get easier, it got more complex, right? So the length of our testing cycles increased. The time between feedback started to increase. QA evolved into a specialty profession where the number of team members even increased, right? Now, we could automate some testing, which it did help, right? But in the 90s, right, something unexpected happened, right? And right, in 1990, about 35% of the homes had a home computer. By 2000, now 60% of the homes had a computer, right? Today, right, the number is somewhere well over 90%. I don't even think they track it so much anymore, right? But over 90% had at least one home computer, and on average, 5 connected devices, right? This was kind of the result of the dot-com boom, right? The internet craze started, you've got mail, AOL, right? Home computing became a thing. It became something that attracted people, right? Which meant that everybody was jumping on this digital age bandwagon, right? It's kind of this move from the industrial age to the start of the computing age to the pinnacle or launching point where it now moved mainstream. It moved from industry and office into mainstream and home life, right? So kind of a shifting into this digital age, right? And what, as a result of that, right, once was what considered cool or unique if somebody was technology enabled or they had a web page, right, now became expected. And consumers started to demand more and more faster, right? Personal service was replaced with online convenience, right? Today, it's in our homes, our cars, our phones, our watches, smart devices, right? It's everywhere, right? If you're not playing the game, right, chances are that you're behind, right? So essentially, every company now, in some way, is in the software game, whether it's their primary industry or not, right? And we're still in the early stages, right? The speed of innovation is only going to increase from this point forward. Change will only increase faster from this point forward. Demand will increase, right? Companies that cannot adapt to this pace are the ones who will be left behind. And we're already sort of seeing that, right? Right. This also means how we manage people changes, but how we think about building software is also changing rapidly, right? Which means we have to think now about enabling quality and how that must change too, right? Um, right. In other words, this doesn't necessarily apply anymore, right? To a degree, I think what we've thought of about the QA process, right, for a period of time, it became the goal, right? It became less about software quality and more about how do we apply the process, right? And just bear with me on this for a little bit, right? Because we often see this even still today of this need or desire to kind of back a singular thought process into doing it. And it kind of trips people up trying to back into that. To a degree, this notion of this is the singular way to approach quality has kind of become like a family heirloom, right? Where it's been passed or handed down from one manager to another, person to person, right? We defend it rigorously as the way, right? And anything that was not the way was rejected or would not work, right? And we kind of saw that coming out of the 2000s. And here's where kind of I landed on that, right? Because that's sort of what I went through back in 2007 is, right, I had to let go of it for a period of time to look at it differently. While there's still value in that work and the lessons that were learned from it, um, right, the reality it's struggling to keep up. And we need to shift away to new solutions that are already starting to emerge today to solve the problems that we're having today from a modern approach, right? So you kind of get into this new age of thinking, right? Or something new was needed, right? Now, in 2001, you also had Agile coming onto the scene, right? Right, which challenged the manufacturing mindset of building software, right? In order to move faster, to satisfy customers, to compete in this digital age, we needed something different, right? As a result, right, the working in shorter cycles, small incremental deliverable, this focus on fast feedback, we have had this explosion of development languages, technology, with options, right, that have more than have ever existed today, right? There's more languages, technology stacks, libraries, testing tools than there ever has been before. The development community exploded with options that not only just increase the capabilities, but there has also been advancements in how to validate and deploy software faster than ever, right? In fact, today with the right mindset and approach, we can go from code change to validated production deployment in just minutes, right? That capability exists today, right? So what are they looking at? Right now, today you may hear this called like DevOps or DevSecOps, right? You may actually even know people that are working in that space today. And while we may have DevOps engineers, quote unquote, as a person's title, it's important not to lose sight that DevOps itself is an approach, a mindset that was focused on enablement, right? It was about looking at code and production and that relationship as one fluid system, right? Where speed, quality, reliability incrementally evolve through ongoing enablement, right? It's a learning cycle, right? It's an ongoing maturity cycle, right? It's no longer handoffs and staged. It's a fluidity, right? And where we no longer have long stages or handoffs, right? With just this continuous flow along the path, right? And sort of once you kind of lean into that mindset a little bit, right, it starts to shift the perspective of what's possible. For me, that was around 2009. 2009, I helped launch my first complete end-to-end continuous integration delivery pipeline, right? Where at a push of a button, right? We still had it as a push button, right? But we could actually back up, build, deploy, and run automated tests and release to production completely without human intervention in under 2 hours, right? Back then, that was fast, but it was the first time where we completed that cycle end to end, right? Now, what was different is, right, it took vision and boldness to set the goal that it was important. It became a priority to remove the human side of that, to actually automate and make it possible. It took dev, QA, and operations to collaborate on some old, long-lived problems, right? Those problems had to kind of take the backseat to tradition at that point in time. And how do we rethink this? It made us evaluate what it means to validate software, right? Not just how do we test software, but how do we validate it along the way? And what other tools could we pull in to even make sure it was possible? It caused us to challenge hard assumptions, right? We held tightly onto some of those for a while, and there was some battles of mindset in there, right? And and even how the software development process itself worked, right? It was not immediate, right? I'm trying not to make that sound like ultimate nirvana. It took time, it took commitment, it took wrestling through some hard things, it took experimentation, but in the end, we actually did it. And it was in that moment where we changed our development culture, right? It was monumental in the effects that we had once we crossed that bridge, right? And I think today, with all that's available, there's people, organizations, maybe yourself, struggling with getting things out of testing, right? Still fighting some of those age-old battles, right? And kind of here's a little bit of how, right, we started with this. Right. For me, it was this question, right? It was an interesting question. And even today, as an Agile coach, I still get this one all the time, right? But what I think is we're asking the wrong question, right? How do we apply the QA process in Agile, right? It's not that it's a bad question, but I think there's a better question that comes out there, right? Because this one kind of assumes that we want to backfill the QA process as the end result, right? And that there's only one choice for it. Right. And in many ways, that limits how we think about possible solutions, right? That it is the only solution that we have available, right? But once we change the question and we ask a different question, then we get a different perspective on things, right? Right. So really, it's not a question of how do we fit the QA process in, right? What really boils down to is how do we ensure we always have a high quality product, regardless of role, that we have the confidence to release on demand, right? So this pulls in development, this pulls in architecture, this pulls in programming structure, it pulls in operations, it pulls in quality, it pulls in the organization into a different set of questions, right? In other words, what does the market need and what does our product have to be? What tools do we need to apply across the board to be able to get there, validate it, so that we can always have the ability to release on demand, not just once, not just in a project, not just in a cycle, right? How do we maintain the state of quality in the applications that we're building, right? So there are 4 areas I want to explore today as we go through this, right? Right. And the first one, right, it involves a shift to product thinking and test approaches, right? And for this here, right, we actually have to consider, like, what is the product life cycle? What are the market expectations? What is the risk acceptance from our customer base or from the market actually in our application? In other words, right, as we're putting this effort to do the development, right, what success from the company hinges on the long-term success, and where does the market, what's their comfort level with what their expectations is. If it's business critical, probably very, very high. If it's a simple email capture application for marketing, right, short-lived, not so long, right? So there's some variance in there. Learning to think from a product perspective is part of the way of getting there. The other thing is nowadays with the pace of everything, right? Software on demand, your competitor is coming up and replacing your product. Startups all over the place, consumer fickleness, right? Speed matters, right? And if we're talking about speed inside testing, then the time that any of our development teams has to build something and get feedback matters, right? That's where we influence how quickly we can move things out the door, right? It's interesting, right? Agile, Scrum, Kanban, right? If you're in that realm, won't make you go fast, right? Initially, maybe you see some performance gains, right? But if we actually want to talk about speed and quality at the same time, how we think about feedback and how we get it quickly back to the developers actually matters in being able to do that quickly in a repeatable process. Bring back testing, right? So I think a lot of times, right, the QA process as we know it has shifted more towards a document process than a testing process. All right. Now, that's not to say there's not good testers inside of the space. I just think the Agile Manifesto talked about collaboration over documentation. I think there's a way to start shifting more testing time over documentation as an output in this to get us to better results. Right. And then the last concept there, right, is getting to this idea of being able to release on demand. In other words, separating release when it's exposed to a customer from deployment, the active moving code around, right? And breaking that as a hard coupling is one of the things that kind of helps set free this real-time quality approach mindset for it, right? So jumping into the first topic, right, product quality approach. Pretty broad topic, so we give you enough just to kind of maybe ask some questions in your organization, some takeaways from this, right? So one thing to consider is, right, what does it look like to start taking a product view over a project view, right? A project view usually has an end date. It might be an iteration over an enterprise application. But at the end of the day, when that ends, right, the product side sort of gets lost, right? And if things don't go well in the project from a quality perspective, that output or technical debt can live longer term, right? Because we were trying to pull things in from a certain date perspective, right? And when product view, right, it sets up this mindset, right, that of closing the product, of getting to the end. If we start to take a product view, however, right, it brings some options to the table on how to build and validate. In other words, how our team's going to operate from a day-to-day perspective, right? Now, from an enterprise platform, right, an enterprise platform that has a long life likely needs to focus on being stable in the market, right? Where, you know, a simple email collection page might only live out there for months, right? So in other words, it's not one size fits all. And this helps us stop applying a one size fits all technique, right? Now, if you kind of look, these are the questions I typically go into here, or the areas I like to lead conversations with, right? Get the right folks in the room and start to have a conversation, right? What is our product expectation, right? Is this something a year or less? Is it a 5 year? Is it 10 year? You know, where do we see this in our organization strategy fitting in? What type of effort, right, or how much focus should we put on this, right? So certainly the longer lived, the more enterprise focused it is, the more important it's going to be to keep that intentional technical debt issues, quality concerns down to a minimum, right? What's the market purpose or use, right? Is it casual, right? Or is it business critical or something more to that degree, right? The more this is to the right, again, the more focus we're going to look on pulling certain techniques in because it's important. The customer or organization risk tolerance, right? Is there a super high expectation, or is it a very forgiving market that's comfortable with, maybe rapidly experimenting with new technology, even if it's buggy, right? Somewhere along the line, it's going to fall on a spectrum. Complexity, right? The more complex it is, probably the more techniques we're going to need to pull into it, right? Versus something simple. And then deployment frequency, right? What is the market willing to accept? What is the customer expectation on it? Right, if it's very frequent, highly innovative, you're keeping up with competitive companies that are frequently releasing, right? Techniques around speed of validation are going to be more prominent in the approach than if it's a less frequent release, right? So again, the whole intent behind this is to really ask some business questions around the intent of the application to start to paint a picture of what do we need to solve for when we talk about all the other possible techniques, right? Now, this here is, right, sort of a short list, right? But what we're looking for is moving from quality being owned by one department as gatekeepers, more to a mindset, right? The modern mindset of its shared ownership, right? Right. Product management actually has concerns about quality. Development and architecture should build around satisfying and using tools around those quality concerns. How we test, how we validate, how we deploy, right? It's no longer handoffs in modern development, right? It's this shared ecosystem, and everyone has parts to play in it. Right now, on the left, there's a ton of other tools that we can add out there. Those are just the common layers that we see. We'll pull those in here a little bit more, right? But we see like TDD, BDD, unit test, JavaScript unit testing, integration testing, API test, automation test, manual evaluation, automated deployments, et cetera, come in, right? In other words, there's options. There's a lot more options than there were. Let's utilize them to now craft the ecosystem that needs to happen as we're building our software to sustain speed and quality over the long term, right? The other important thing to think here as an organization, right, is we want to trust that people are doing the right job, but we also need to verify that it's actually hitting those original product expectations back on the other side, right? So what do we need to do to actually make sure we have appropriate code coverage, test coverage, static code analysis, right? 2 sets of eyes on every code. Do we have appropriate quality gates that prevent us from shooting ourselves in the foot by deploying software that doesn't meet that standard, right? Do we have guardrails that actually fail builds to enable that? What is our escaped issue rate and blowback on tracking, right? In other words, at the end of the day, right, it's not, right, the developers are working towards a standard, but the organization actually has to own that standard as well, and to be able to verify that, yeah, this is actually meeting what we want to put out from a production standpoint, right? From this, right, if we have what those are and what those gates are, right, the teams are going to base all the other refinement, estimation, and execution to satisfy that definition or system definition of done on how we define those guardrails. So one of the things that was a realization that kind of came up as I was looking through this in the early days, right, is why does feedback matter, right? Or essentially, why does time to feedback matter? And I think we don't necessarily put enough focus on this as we go through things, right? If you haven't seen this before, this is kind of a typical testing pyramid. Fairly common. What you have in those slices may not matter. But a lot of times, majority of times, we see manual and automated UI testing down here at the bottom, making up the bulk of where we're spending our testing time, right? However, right, it asks the question, is this the best model for speed and rapid deployability, right? It's not bad from a testing perspective. We're going to make sure things are covered, right? But if we're trying to address the market needs around speed and deployability, is that really the where we should be focusing our time and effort, right? So if we start looking at the time to feedback down here, right? From the time code is moved into the environment, right, it could be days, hours or days or more to kind of get the first touch, run stuff through and get that first feedback, right? The human evaluation side is fantastic, right? It's something we certainly want to keep, right? But human error also is sort of a risk, especially if there's time pressures, right? So if there's a lot of manual regression, the pace of things is counterproductive, right? So there's kind of this balance of being able to put eyeballs and thought on it, but how much and how long does it take us to get through there is a factor. Right, you enter into the UI automation realm, right, which is usually a natural extension between these two, or a relationship or path people commonly go. Right, we're now looking at sort of what hours to days, depending on the size of the suite. It certainly is repeatable and reusable, which is a plus, right? But it can be fragile for changes, right, and require a fair bit of rework, right? And the downside to it, lesson I learned personally, right, is the more you have, the slower it goes, right? It's having 30,000 UI automation tests is going to take exponentially more time than just having a few dozen, right? So it's useful in its repeatability. It has benefit. It's probably worth bringing forward, right? But it's still not a fast feedback, right? In modern software development, right, you get into API automation. Now, what's nice about this, if you notice, we start getting down into minutes to an hour, right, to run a series of API tests. Many times, this still requires something to be deployed, but the tests themselves are fairly rapid to build. They're very highly reusable and fairly easy from a maintenance standpoint, right? So from a feedback perspective, right, this is something that can provide the team with rapid feedback, cover a lot of scenarios, feed the inputs, get the outputs back from the application layer, and shortening that feedback loop, right, covering the majority of scenarios. So something you might want to consider to do more heavy lifting, right? And then you get up towards the top of the stack. When we start looking at unit testing, right, and even some of the approaches around test-driven development up there, which is where that lives, where these can run thousands of tests in seconds, right? If somebody makes a change, right, they can actually run a build, run that locally, and know if they broke something in seconds, right? In fact, there is technology out there today. I know it's in Visual Studio. Most of the other IDEs have this, where it actually runs on live threads as the programmer is programming. And as they're writing code, it's breaking and flagging it as red. And as they repair it and put it back together, it's turning the indicator back to green. That's about as close to real-time feedback as you can get, right? Because it's not only running over the entire code base, it's also it's giving real-time feedback to the developer, like, hey, you broke something, let's fix it. You broke something unintentionally, let's fix it, right? Or take a look at how the tests are. It is the fastest feedback out there that is post code change. Right when it gets into it is code structure matters, right? And that's sort of the roots behind test-driven development. Right, that's sort of a little bit more of an advanced topic, right? But if you're not familiar with it, test-driven development is this concept that it starts by writing the unit tests first, right? In other words, what do I need to make sure works at the end of it, right? And the person making the code change would actually write a series of tests that need to be proven true to know that he solved the problem correctly. As he's writing the code, right, and he's executing and building it, those tests start checking from red to green, right? And maybe there's 20 tests out there that's covering the new class that he's written, right? When all those are green, he knows he's good, right? So test-driven development is a development mindset and a development approach that a lot of mature developers have started adopting. One, fast feedback for them, but two, it also forces them to structure their code in a more test-friendly, smaller logic way of approaching the code, right? So they're not connecting things that shouldn't be connected together, right? It starts getting into clean code. Try to speak a little less technical there, right? Clean, well-structured code is a side effect and an outcome for hitting TDD as an approach. So it's interesting. Right. So, right, if we look at this pyramid, right, where typically we see team time being invested, right, a lot of times we find that this is the smallest investment, but it's the fastest feedback, right? And as we get down the stack, this is technically the slowest feedback, but often tends to be the largest investment, right? And when we start getting into a modern testing pyramid, it actually begs the question of should we figure out how to start inverting it when it comes to enterprise software development, right? When we flip the pyramid, right, we see that time to feedback reduce. We're no longer waiting days to find out if something broke, right? What we're doing is we're narrowing down the broad validation that this thing still works, that the application still works, that we can rapidly get that feedback. Developer doesn't have to wait for a handoff or a build to get manual intervention, right? They know 80% of it, 85% of it is going to be captured by that top half now. And then when we start getting down into things like UI automation and manual testing, right, that's still important, right? But UI automation is not your safety net, right? That's there to make sure that things still operate end to end. We can reduce the scope of the testing there, right? Still useful, still valuable. It's now appropriate for how the tool is supposed to be used, right? And our manual testing efforts can really focus on the changes at hand versus trying to catch that massive regression bucket, which other layers are better at capturing, right? So this concept around inverting the pyramid, right, is kind of critical to this thought around what modern software validation looks like, right? Now, oh, two questions. I think I picked one. What was the second one? What are my thoughts on involving customers in testing activities? We're going to talk about that. So just hang on. We will get there. I'm a fan, right? So when we talk about bringing testing back, right, this notion that automated is testing, right, is a little bit off, right? To kind of put this where it really needs to be. Automation is not testing, it's checking, right? It can't think, it only does what it's told. It can't evaluate experience, right? It has no emotion to evaluate whether or not they like the experience that they just went through in executing the software. It doesn't have a sense of good or bad, just pass or fail based on the conditions it's been told. It doesn't have eyes, so it really doesn't have a sense of good design or good UX experience, right? It's good, it's valuable, it has a purpose, right? And that purpose is to provide fast feedback on what has been built, right? So know that we have not broken anything, right? So that teams will have the trust and confidence in what they're deploying, that everything that they already did is still working. We found that out in minutes. Now let's move into actually testing what was new, right? So when we think about testing, right, I have some strong opinions here, right, that might be shocking, right? But maybe it's an aha for some, right? Most of the time that we spend in testing today is not actually doing testing, right? We spend time on requirements analysis, documentation, plans, cases, forming the perfect test script. We've become really good at documenting, right? We've become really good on waiting for things to be complete in order to verify our documentation, and then kind of getting stuck trying to fit it into a sprint rushing at the end. Right? The whole setup, right, also makes it hard for any non-QA member to help, right? That was mind-blowing for me when I first kind of had that realization that, right, for me and the teams I led, right, that our testing was not a whole lot of seat time actually testing, right? When it boiled down to application time versus document time, our ratio was way off, right? Right, we spent most of the time in the sprint doing things that didn't involve using the application. It wasn't doing anything from an exploratory nature, and very little curiosity. We were trying to think in a vacuum up front, not using the application. It was not much about evaluation, right? That kind of got lost. It was checking a box that we actually, did I run test 101? Check. Did I run test 102? Check, right? Evaluation was removed. Notice we were doing less critical thinking. It was actually a hard skill to get back, where we couldn't adjust on the fly as quickly as we used to or as fluidly as we should. Discovery, there usually wasn't time for discovery, right? The goal was to kind of get through all the tests and prove that they all passed. Well, what happened to exploring and discovering uniqueness in the application and evaluating it, and letting a tester go back to the roots of testing, right? See, testing is not checking a box that a test case was run. Testing is an evaluatory process, right? That uses all of those skills that are up there on the screen, right? Which beg the question of how do we get more time in the seat testing? How do we make it so everyone can test, right? What skills do I need to start reinforcing on my team to have so that we can start bringing this back, right? Which started down this path of more of less of, right? As a leader, I had to ask that, right? What skills was I reinforcing and what ones do I need to start reinforcing, right? Which moved to the shift of less document focused, right? I think you need some level of documentation, right? But can we get it more evaluation focused, right? So instead of being a gatekeeper, I want my testing folks to actually give a status or an opinion or an evaluation of what they experienced, right? From a quality perspective, they are able to tell me when it's good or when it's bad, right? But not, right, to work with the team on that, right? Which got into this building out skills around context-based testing, charter-based exploratory, session-based test management, and team-based mindset and group and session testing, right? So it's this shift from one side of the spectrum to the other, right? And the four things that really made a difference there, right, was one, right, with the team, I had a set intent of we're moving down this path. We want you to do more exploratory testing and document as you go than doing the documentation up front, right? Gave them permission to become testers again. To get this concept of team level test ideation, not just QA test ideation. In other words, if the team is responsible for shared quality, how do we get the team involved in it, right? Moving towards an adoption of charter-based exploratory, we'll talk about that in a second, and session-based ideas and test management, right? So can't cover all of that, but I do want to touch on just a few here, right? If we think about this whole notion of shifting left from documentation to more real-time testing and even shared responsibility, right? If you're running an agile team, right, is there an opportunity to do preemptive testing? In other words, before a line of code is even written. And one of the things that was a real needle mover for me was this idea of how do we bring testing into the refinement conversation, right? It's kind of that like duh moment of do we actually talk about it? Right. And if we think about our refinement sessions, right, commonly we see about how do we solve it? What are the development activities? But do we actually ask and participate with questions about what's the best way to validate it? What are the risky areas when developing this? What is the most important part to the product or the customer, right, that we need to focus on making sure is right? What are the variations in inputs or outputs that could trigger something to go wrong? What could fail, right? What could go wrong, right? So one of the things that we immediately started doing was shifting our teams to have these getting comfortable about talking quality. And actually, as part of refinement was an output of our test risk, our quality speed bumps before a developer even wrote a line of code, right? And what we saw by just adopting this one very simple technique is the development's approach this now more aware, and it influenced how they did the tasking. It influenced how they approached solving the problems. It influenced how we communicated around certain areas of it, right? It was kind of that far shift even beyond testing to preemptive quality. All right, so it was not a natural conversation to start. It felt awkward, and it took the team a little while to get comfortable with it, right? But once they had it, it sort of became natural now as part of the shared process of owning what it looked like to develop something as a team. The second concept was this exploration in the charter-based exploratory, right? Now, charter-based is not ad hoc testing, although it does have some similarities, right? Ad hoc is sort of, I just go out and do whatever I want. Charter-based is actually a very distinct technique as where it encompasses simultaneous testing and test design, right? In other words, it asks testers to start testing around an idea and log what has been tested, right? So what it's looking to do is maximize that time in seat for the tester, actually using the application versus writing documentation about the application, right? So it starts with a charter, right, which is usually a set of inputs, right? Test ideation around what are the topics that we need to cover, right? Usually pulling in context from what's on the screen. Do I have a data grid? Do I have a form? Right? If it's a form, I'm thinking about validation. If it's a data grid, I'm thinking about page loading or inline edit, or right, whatever that is, right? This loose outline of starter ideas, right? And then that comes up with a charter for that session. It has a time box, right? Usually 60 or 90 minutes around that topic. The goal for the tester now is to start with one single idea, test it, write a log or a note on what they found, move on to the next, move on to the next. And for that 60 to 90 minutes, now explore and test around that concept. As they come up with an idea, right, they're going to add that to the list. They're going to go ahead and test that. They're going to put the results in, which is going to generate new ideas about how to test it. And if they're still within that time box, add the note and the list of what was tested, what were the inputs, what were the outcomes. The idea behind that is for that 60 to 90 minute thing, we don't stop testing, right? So if we have questions about something that we see, right, we are logging that we have a question about something, we keep testing. If we find something that's a defect, we're going to grab a quick screenshot, we're going to make a note, but then we're going to go move on and test around it while it's fresh in our head, right? Because that's going to generate the most ideas about what to test next, right? It stops the pause, open up a new script, run a script, log, pause, stop, right? It basically says for a period of time as testers, we're in the seat to get through as much as possible. At the end, right, we do a debrief. Which involves looking at the log. What did we test? Documenting any cases that came out of that need to be there for posterity, right? So let the output of testing now create the cases. What are ideas or areas that we uncovered that we need to go back and do more testing on? What are the issues that we found? Let's go through and actually validate and log them. What's interesting is it feels a little weird to start, but most testers actually appreciate the concentrated test time versus hopping in and out of some of the other tools, right? So charter-based exploratory can be a unique way to get more testing in an agile environment because it doesn't have to wait for anything other than some basic ideation and outputs. There's a ton of resources out there on this today that's able to be looked at. Right, which kind of also piggybacks right in this notion of session-based test management. Now, the main idea behind session-based is to create a focused testing time for one or more people, right? The goal is to spend a max amount of time in the application to just test and explore, right? In that session report, we talk about the charter or charters that were run previously, what areas have been tested, detailed notes on any bugs that were found, right? Right. So kind of what is the mission, right? What is our charter? What is the session, right? That uninterrupted time box, as well as the session report and debrief. What was tested, what was found, and what's next. The beauty of this is it doesn't, anybody can participate, right? So I think that was one of the questions up there, and we're going to even blow that out a little bit more. But once we have this and we have the ideas and we take the complexity out of testing, right? And we free people up to say your charter is the test around here. All you have to do is log what you do. It means that anybody on the team can also participate on this. Now, the way I personally like to use test sessions is by putting an hour session a day, right? Or maybe a couple times a week where the team gets together and tests, right? This is right. Maybe there's a morning session and the afternoon session 3 days a week. We set aside, 60 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever you can afford. But the goal is to bring the team together around the stories that were done, focus testing on there, right, to be able to move that story to done, right? So it's this immense concentration now around the session. Because the session operates as part of the team as testing time, right, it creates a delineation between waiting for things to get handed off and things to get built, right? Kind of creates a purpose before it, right? Now, there's a natural extension that comes out of that, right, which is mob and swarm-based testing, right? Now, these are actually kind of fun, right? With mob, basically, this is getting a large group of people, the team, stakeholders, anybody willing to help, right, for a 60 to 90-minute test session, right? This can cover multiple charters or multiple areas. And oftentimes we will have people pair up around the same charter and run two different paths down it. It is a huge concentration of testing in a very short period of time. Right now, there's a variation on mob testing, right? And by the way, mob, you can bring in customer service reps, your product owner can do it, your developers can do it, stakeholders can do it, anybody that can operate a keyboard can participate, right? That's kind of the intent behind it, is we get a mob of people to cover the application in a very short period of time using Charter Exploratory. The spin I love on this is Swarm, where Swarm is essentially a mob, but now developers are out with the keyboard open, the IDE open, and as we're finding things, it moves into live debug and live fix, right? Sort of an advanced technique, but when push comes to shove and time is of the essence, we will bring testing and development together into these swarm sessions where, as stuff is being found, developers and testers pair off, troubleshoot, pair it, fix it, rebuild it, put it back in there, and we're finding and fixing as close together as we possibly can. Really, really cool, really, really powerful. And I usually find out that developers and testers teams like doing that. Just not something you can do all the time, right? Because, well, you could, but I kind of try to measure how often I'm doing that. There's a time and a place for it. Very, very effective, fun to do, right? So getting out into our last concept here, really just want to expand kind of the basics of this, which is this concept of decoupling release and deployment, right? From a terminology matter standpoint, right? Deployment is moving code from one environment to the other, right? Simply the art of moving from dev to QA, QA to stage, wherever code flows. Where release is a business decision to expose changes to one or more customers, right? So if we get in this habit of being able to develop on a cadence, right, and deploy at will, then release is something that is managed differently. It becomes a business decision, right? Now, this is something that takes enablement to be able to do, right? Kind of the desired outcome, right, is, right, a sprint or a PI or any time boxes for planning. Code should be able to move whenever it is ready, right? So it takes some technical capability to be able to do that. Code should be able to move independent of other pending changes, right? So no longer tightly coupling story A to story B in an end of the sprint release, right? How do you get to a point in your organization where in your branching and management strategy, code change A can be released at any time independent from code change B and still have it merge back into a functional application, right? When you have that, right, you now have the ability to start removing humans from the process and automate the integration and validation steps that support that, right? So having those layers of automation that we talked about earlier, right, now lets you rapidly validate every change or the majority of it, every change, so that you start getting confidence in the ability to release on demand. Now, release on demand gets into other things, right, such as, do we have the ability to feature flag or hide code or branch by abstraction, right, these code changes that are flowing to production, so that even if something gets out, a customer never sees it, and it becomes a business decision of when and who we turn that on for customers, right? So it's kind of more of a larger end goal at the end, but requires investment into some of the previous mindsets to be able to get there, right? Right, so that kind of brings it to a close from a content and time perspective. Happy to connect on Facebook or LinkedIn. Continue the conversation. We do the monthly webinar series. We do try to do at least one a month. While I don't have the topic yet, I know the next one is going to be on November 17th at 11 a.m. And going to be hosted by Chris Bokamp. The topic will be announced on the website soon. So feel free to go out, visit our website, register, log in for future webinars. and thank you.